Hello, everybody. This is kind of exciting. I have to say, every time I come to the Conduit, I feel so much energy. It's such a great venue. So first thing, huge thank you to the Conduit for having us. It's such a pleasure to be here and to speak in front of you all. Now, before I talk a little bit about some of the research I've seen being passed around, I just want to introduce you to the real stars of the show, because no one's here to hear me. So to my immediate right, we've got Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh. Professor Whitmarsh is the Professor of Environment Psychology at the University of Bath, and she's also the Director for the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. She also works with myself and Ade on the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, which I'm sure you're going to hear a little bit more about through the evening. Next to Lorraine, we've got Dr. Simon Evans. Simon is the Deputy Editor and Senior Policy Editor at Carbon Brief. I would think most people who are in this room and are engaged in climate change will know who Carbon Brief are. They are one of the agenda-setting, what do you call papers, websites, sources of climate information in this space. And Simon also won the prestigious, what's it called? The Press Gazette Energy and Environment Journalist of the Year 2022, which is no mean feat. It really is a heck of an accolade, so well done for that. And next to Simon, we have Clover. Clover is the founder of Force of Nature, a not-for-profit that helps young people turn eco-anxiety into action. I've been fortunate enough to be in the room when Clover's spoken before. She's such an awesome speaker, and every time I hear her speak about her experience, I think it's a real example of how we can move and energize young people. So awesome to have Clover here. And finally, last but not least, Ade Adepitan. Ade is a Paralympic medalist, a TV presenter, children's author. He's also, when we set up Climate Crisis Advisory Group, he was the first and only choice we had to be our host. He had recently, when we did that, done his TV series, Ade on the Front Line, which was looking at climate change. And I just thought it was an incredible series, and so it was amazing that he immediately said yes. So join me in giving these amazing guests a round of applause. So before I kick off the conversation in earnest, I want to talk briefly about the research that you'll see some of my guests holding. And I have to say, I'm really excited because I've also had lots of questions about it already. And it seems to have stirred the pot a bit, which is exactly what you want with these things. And I wanted to really talk about why we did it. Over the last 2 years, 3 years, we've worked more and more in the climate space and in the sustainability space. I should say, as Firstlight, I'm here as a director of Firstlight. We're a communications agency. Some of you will know us, some of you won't. And we've worked more and more in this space. And I've had this earwig that's just been nagging away at us, as it does for most of us. Are we preaching to the choir? Are we just patting ourselves on the back and saying the stuff that we know resonates with the community that we speak to? And I'm seeing lots of nodding heads, because I think anyone who works in this space has that feeling sometimes. And so we sort of thought, well, how do we kind of define that and see who they are and what they care about? So that's what we did. We did some research that did some quantitative stuff. So we went out into the field, and then we also did a focus group. And I have to say, again, I was not the person who facilitated that focus group. It was with 6 climate change deniers. I would not have had the patience or the wherewithal to stick with that. But it sure was eye-opening and quite an experience to sit in on it, I can tell you. And they were as kind of stereotypical as you could possibly imagine a group of climate change deniers being, I have to say. But I'm going to quickly rattle through some of the findings that I think were particularly pertinent and eye-opening from what we saw. So the first is that 25% of UK adults are either what we define as deniers or delayers. What's really obvious is that the straight denial is shrinking. There's a smaller proportion who don't believe that climate change exists, and that's borne out in some of the research that I know Lorraine is going to talk to. But there's still a big part that don't think that it's a real and present danger. 25%, that's 17 million people in this country that don't believe climate change is a clear and present danger. And I guess my first thought was, does that matter? Does it matter? It's only a quarter. But I think if Brexit and if COVID have taught us anything, it's that you ignore that vocal minority at your peril. And so I do think there's a real job to think about how we engage with them and what sort of messages we give them. So a little bit more of what we found out. We basically separated these people into three typologies, if you like. Conspirators, they're the typical deniers, they're everything you'd expect. And there really were some people there who were pretty tinfoil hat. There are contrarians, and this made up a lot of them. These were the people who just are contrarian on everything. They're the Brexiters, they're everything. So those guys, we felt, are going to be slightly easier to reach. And then finally, there's the powerless. They're uncertain, they're confused, and they're possibly a bit helpless as well. And I think it was really interesting to see that those guys were characterized as, they were actually hungry for information, and they want it presented in a slightly more friendly way to them. So just a couple more stats before I kick off the question. Only 44% of people can confidently explain what net zero is. One real quote: scientists are good at being scientists, they aren't good at communicating. That's a problem. 42% of people feel like they're being lectured to about climate change. Lots of nodding heads. 36% of adults are exhausted by climate change. I think that one really resonated with me. We talk in communications about being consistent and putting the same information out. We just need to be a bit careful that we're not inundating people with the same, and I'm going to say negative messages that I think are exhausting for people. 52% of people feel powerless, and I'm going to ask Lorraine a little bit about that, about how we might help people feel less powerless in the fight against climate change. Three things that were particularly interesting, I think. Also, lots of people, and particularly within this group, they want to know why it matters to them. There were some real eye-opening moments, particularly when this took place around the time when the Pakistan floods were happening. I was struck by how it just didn't resonate with them. It was pretty awful, it was pretty horrible to see, but it wasn't them. And one of them even said, if I was in Pakistan, maybe I'd care. Now, that's awful, but we have to be realistic. We have to be honest about what we're trying to break through. Massive trust issues. We in this room, by them, would be seen as the liberal elite. We to them are the people that can't be trusted. We are the governments, we are the lobbies. To them, how that's defined is not relevant, and I think it's really important that we remember that. Finally, those who've seen the report, that we did something with trigger words, which I thought was really fun. We gave them a bunch of words and just asked for straight up, what do you think of these? I'll share a couple. Green, costly and woke. Net zero, what does it mean? Unachievable. Activist, unwashed, smelly. Climate crisis, alarmist, uncertain. I think that's really important. All of us here, we're used to talking to each other, and we understand what these things really mean and how we talk about them. I think we need to just be a little bit more cognizant of what these things mean to others. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to go to Lorraine first, because Lorraine was kind enough to feed into this report, and perhaps I can start with you and talk about some of the science and the research that perhaps backs up some of the messaging within the report.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Zach. So, yeah, I think this was absolutely fascinating, this research, and it resonates with a lot of the research that we've done as well, highlighting that climate change is an issue which is very difficult. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Climate change is an issue which actually most people find quite difficult to engage with. It's a global, long-term, complex issue. It's not something that necessarily day-to-day we are kind of like, that does influence our decision-making. So I think a lot of the issues that this report raises highlight some of the challenges with communicating with the general public, not just with this particularly hard-to-reach group. And many of the concerns they had, I think, would resonate more widely as well. They highlight things like it's expensive to be green, we haven't got credible leadership on climate change, I feel powerless. And actually, I think that most people amongst the public would agree with many of those things, which highlights the fact that actually we need to engage the general public with climate change through a number of different things, and not just this group. So Communications is a big part of that, and we know how to communicate a bit more effectively. For example, highlighting some of the positive co-benefits of climate action. So the fact that, for example, it can help reduce energy bills, and at the moment that is likely to resonate more widely with people. There are health benefits, well-being benefits of many climate actions we can take. So even if people don't necessarily care about climate change or even think that it's a hoax, actually, if we reframe the issue and talk about these wider benefits, we can cut through and get to those wider motivations that actually most people have. We can also give people this sense of powerlessness, I think, came through very strongly for a lot of the people that you engage with. And that is something that I think people feel more widely, because it's a global issue, and there is a sense that the government is not doing very much. But actually, the more we can communicate what people are starting to do, that there are actually success stories, that things are starting to change, convey a sense that you are part of a movement of change, that things are happening, people like you are starting to change. So it's about making it seem normal, attractive, easy. Highlighting that change is possible, I think, is really important. I think also trusted messengers is something that we need to think about, and that you covered in the report as well. And those messengers are going to differ for different audiences in some cases. And so climate scientists, while they might sort of generally be reasonably well trusted, they're not necessarily the ones that are going to work best for this group. And you talked about us being kind of liberal elites in this room. We're probably not the best people necessarily to be communicating with some of these people if they don't trust us, if they just see us as being too different. So trusted messengers are going to be people that are credible and that share the values of that audience. And so we need to think about who those people are. But I think my final thought is that communication alone isn't going to be enough, because I think everybody sort of feels guilty about the fact that we're not doing more on climate change, and I think some of that comes through here too. We need to remove the barriers to behaviour change, and communication alone isn't going to be enough. So we do need to make it easier, cheaper, more attractive for people to change their behaviour, whether or not they care about climate change. So that's some of the sort of wider context that then makes that communication a bit easier.
Thanks, Lorraine. Simon, I wonder if I'm going to throw what I think might be a slightly challenging one at you, which is misinformation. I think we have a huge problem in this populist world that people can just shout really loudly. And I'm going to use the example of how often do we see on Twitter that the reason energy bills are high is because of renewables? What should we, and you as a bastion of the media, what can we do better? What do we need to do to help counter that?
I mean, I guess I would start by saying that I think over the last decade there's actually been a really positive shift in UK media coverage of climate change as an issue. So we published some analysis about a year ago where we basically categorised and searched through all of the newspaper editorials from the UK, UK newspaper titles, and looked at how they talked about climate change as a problem and the solutions to climate change as well. And we found this really dramatic reduction in sort of overt climate scepticism from editorial pages. And also, a shift towards much more positive framing around solutions, whether it's renewables or whatever else. I think the however is that in the last year, basically, since we've had this energy crisis triggered by Russia and its invasion of Ukraine, there's been a real kind of retrenchment there. So we haven't, certainly in the sort of editorial pages, we haven't seen that much of the kind of overt scepticism, climate denial that we might have seen, kind of 10 years ago. But there's been a massive increase in the amount of kind of climate, discourses of climate delay, as it's been described, people saying, oh, it's too difficult, or it's too expensive, or we shouldn't bother because China isn't, or, all of these kind of tropes that come out. And then alongside that, as Zach mentions, there's been this, a lot of noise on, places like Twitter, YouTube, and so on, pushing back on net zero and, kind of arguing that it's the problem rather than the solution to the energy crisis. I think what's really interesting about the kind of, the energy crisis that we're in now is that we're at this moment, had that happened 5 years ago, I think we would be looking at a really, really different kind of political and public context, because at that time, it still wasn't so blindingly obvious that renewables were, the cheapest option for the cheapest way to get electricity. It wasn't clear at that point that, the entire car industry, bar a few kind of laggards, is moving towards electric vehicles. That momentum and sense of inevitability about the transition wasn't so strong, and it would have been much harder for governments to kind of hold firm. I think because of the context we're in now, in places like the UK, where parts of the Conservative Party are pushing very hard against net zero, they're kind of coming up against a bit of a brick wall. We've seen the sort of reshuffle of departments, but net zero being firmly still in there in the remit of this new energy security and net zero department. And I think it's hard to imagine it having been, if we'd been 5 years earlier, I'm not sure it would have been like that. Just on the social media thing, I'm quite depressed about the state of social media. People have been talking a lot about, AI and chat GPT and what that's going to mean for, public discourse, the media and so on. I think that actually what's sort of a bit more invisible, but actually more relevant right now, compared to AI, is the power of the algorithm. So by which I mean the Twitter algorithm, the YouTube algorithm. What things become viral? How is it that climate skeptic talking points about the mining requirements of wind turbines or whatever it might be become incredibly successful? And we genuinely have seen shifts in the sort of nature of discourse on Twitter since Musk took over. So they've obviously changed something. No one quite knows what, and it just, I think, really illustrates that the power, the hidden power of the algorithm, which is just a total black box, and we really can't do anything about.
I think that's really interesting, and actually it plays quite nicely into what I wanted to ask you, Clover, about, which is how we engage with young people. I'm conscious that so many young people today are getting their latest science information from TikTok, from whatever platforms that they're on, and algorithms are obviously going to play a critical role there as well. More broadly, one thing that came out in the research that I thought was really interesting was I felt there was quite a lot of synergy with how disengaged this group were compared to how disengaged some young people are, even though what we were talking to was mostly older, whiter, classically entrenched. I'm interested in what your experience is in getting through to perhaps a younger audience who might be just as disengaged.
I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to take the scenic route. I was so excited to read this report because I have been fascinated by this stuff since I declared myself a climate activist at the ripe age of 11. You dirty, smelly activist. So to back up a little bit, when I was 16, I was on my way back from COP21 in Paris. And I remember having gone into that process feeling this huge sense of relief and this huge weight off my shoulders, because I felt finally there are going to be adults in the room who know what to do with this issue. And of course, I showed up to a conference that was sponsored by the likes of Coca-Cola, Shell, BMW, and I'd never seen greenwashing on such an unapologetic scale. I'd never met calcified leaders so expert in making commitments scheduled far enough into the future that they required no immediate action. And I remember coming from that experience feeling deeply disillusioned and feeling the powerlessness that I think a lot of people referred to through this project and through this study. Now, when I went back to school, my teacher introduced me to a word that completely changed my outlook on the climate crisis. He said, there was an environmental educator, David Sebel, who in 1996 defined the word ecophobia. And he described it as the feeling of powerlessness in the face of cataclysmic environmental change. And this was a huge turning point because COP had shown me that we've had the technology and the resources and the ingenuity to solve the climate crisis for decades. And yet, critically, we've lacked the mindset. Critically, we've lacked the will. And I think this report exposes denial and delay in the general public. But I think we also need to talk about denial and delay in the highest places of power and influence, where there isn't the excuse, of not having the time to think about it, of not having the resource, of not having privilege. I see denial by way of, well, climate change is big, but maybe it's not really that big, and maybe it's not actually happening. But I see it every day talking to leaders in business and policy who entertain techno-utopian solutions that will make them a lot of money while continuing to profit off the continued exploitation of vulnerable communities. I see denial in leaders saying, well, why don't we spend $1 billion on a carbon capture technology rather than in protecting forests, the best carbon capture technology of all? So I think in all of this, it's really important to identify the many ways in which denial shows up and to recognize them in ourselves as well, and particularly when you're coming from a place of privilege. And I think you acknowledge this in yourself, Zach, but even in the way that you framed the introduction, there was a lot of us versus them thinking, right? And I think we really have to examine that, and we really have to dismantle it, because actually the reality is all of us are entertaining different versions of denial. And the moment we can approach this conversation from that human level of we're all somehow complicit, we're all contributing to varying degrees, then I think we can have a much more honest, transparent conversation. And the final thing I will say to actually answer your question, Zach, on young people. So I'm not sure if it's rude to reference another study, but we led the largest ever study on youth mental health and climate, where we surveyed 10,000 young people across 10 countries. And what we found from that is that 56% of young people believe that humanity is doomed. I would challenge the assumption that young people are disengaged. I can't tell you how many old white dudes come up to me after panels like these to say, oh, but young people don't vote. Young people, like a lot of us, are deeply disillusioned and deeply untrusting toward systems and institutions of power, and they are right to be. So ultimately, the conversation needs to become, wherever you are on the denial spectrum, wherever you are on the questioning spectrum, how do you create pathways for agency, for people to feel empowered, to feel like they can actually make a difference? Because if we can unblock that, then I think we can really galvanize people in a meaningful way.
Totally agree. I think one of the things that struck me when I was actually in the room and then thinking about it afterwards, there's an awful lot of ego involved. And we really do, within the climate community, have to kind of leave our egos at the door a little bit and say, I think what struck me was, as someone who's talked quite a lot to climate activists, was I was sitting in front of these people who were clearly not climate activists and actively weren't, but there were a lot of the same emotions. There was a lot of confusion and anger, and it struck me that what they were doing was falling back on things that they'd learned age 16, which was not about climate change. It was about pre-climate change ideas, and I think rightly and luckily the next generation are falling back on an education that tells them what sits at its core. So I think there's a lot of lessons and synergy, weirdly, between two polar opposite groups. Ade, I'm going to come to you. I'd like to, I think particularly when we're talking about how we create content that resonates, you've done some amazing TV and you've sort of delivered that front line of what climate change means to homes across the country. Could you talk a little bit about how important that is, and thinking of it particularly in the context of the audience we're talking here, how can we do it better?
Wow, how can we do it better? I mean, first and foremost, I think I do feel sorry for this generation in terms of there's so much information out there. There's so much, and how you disseminate from it and how you look at what's right and wrong and where to go, and you've got people attacking you left, right and centre, wanting your attention all over the place. For me, what I really, I've been passionate about dealing with the climate change issue for probably the last 2 decades. And what I've seen is there's been this disconnect with the science, which I feel it's a real problem because I think, science is kind of our cheat code to progress. As humans, we've learned in so many different ways. But if you're big into computer games, having there's a cheat code which helps you beat the big boss and move on. And I see science as that thing. But it's the way we communicate it, and it's the language that we get it across. And I think what I've tried to understand with my role in the media is, first of all, people tend to engage more with emotion than they do with science or intellectually, which is difficult, but when you know that, it gives you a tool, and it makes you understand that storytelling is such a powerful tool in getting people to engage, and getting people to connect. Because I think one of the real difficulties with climate change is for so many people, especially here in the UK, is it's far, far away. It's far away. It's happening in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Australia, thousands of miles away. We don't see that effect. We just carry on watching Corrie or, The Masked Dancer, and it might rain a little bit or we might have a hot summer. But there are people who are being properly affected by this. And in my documentary series, I wanted to go out there and show these stories and connect the storytelling and show how real people are being affected on the front line, how the wildlife is being affected, and how that connects with us, and connecting it with the science as well.
That's really interesting. And one of the things that I've been mulling over quite a lot recently is the point that you make on wildlife or biodiversity. It strikes me that biodiversity might have a bit of a role as a bridger to climate change for some of this community. They all care about walking their dog. They all care about their local, hyper-local approach. And actually,
I once made a joke about a donkey on the One Show, and I was attacked for it. That's when I realised you can't mess about with animals, and animals really impact on people in this country.
Lorraine, I wonder if does that resonate with the research that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and it was interesting that you did introduce Sir David Attenborough as one of the potential kind of communicators, and huge appeal. I mean, he's like, across the spectrum. And I think, he has brought to life the sort of the wonders of the natural world. And we know, yeah, absolutely, people do engage with nature, with biodiversity in ways that are sort of apolitical in many ways, whereas climate change has become politicized. And what we know, and from our studies, for example, is that on the right of centre politically, it's harder to engage people around climate change because it's seen as more threatening. We have to change lifestyles and businesses and stuff, and that doesn't sit so well in that sense. So, yeah, absolutely. I think through sort of nature connectedness, there is a way maybe to get through to people as well as these wider values that I talked about as well, kind of like health and sort of saving money, other motivations too.
Can I just say something quickly, Zach? I think one of the things we need to get past is, and I mean, I'm going to sound all airy-fairy and liberal elite, but stop weaponizing information. That's what we constantly do. How has something like climate change become political? It's madness. It is really mad that we're sitting here and we're saying it's a political argument. If you're on the right, you have to think about climate change in this way. If you're on the left, you think about it this way. No. It affects us all. It's if an alien came down from space and listened to this debate right now, they would think we are absolutely bonkers.
I think that's so true, and I'm going to put something to Simon here, because I was talking to Craig Bennett from the Wildlife Trust. I had lunch with him the other day, and he said he has a real problem with the media, which is that he is fundamentally positioned as a liberal lefty, basically, as the CEO of the Wildlife Trust, and he's like, all my members are small C conservative. So there's a real disconnect between the way in which we, to your point, Ade, it's almost like we superimpose where the political spectrum fits sometimes. What do you reckon, Simon?
I mean, well, first of all, just on the Attenborough point, I mean, one of the really impactful moments in the kind of UK discourse around climate change, and you can really see this if you look at time series of public opinion, was that, I think it was like early 2019, I can't remember which of the series, but there was one of those big Attenborough series which really went big on climate change in a way that his series hadn't previously. And it was around that time we had, like, you know, the kind of Greta Thunberg coming onto the scene and XR and all of that. But, you know, fundamentally, Attenborough was probably like a really big part of that. And, you know, he's pretty old. What happens when he dies? He's such a, you know, a huge and effective communicator for climate change. It's, you know, big shoes to fill. Just on this, I mean, I think we're relatively lucky in the UK that, you know, it has been, to use the ugly kind of American phrase, quite bipartisan, you know, to an extent. And, you know, some of the, you know, we've had, you know, a series of Conservative-led governments since 2010, and during that period, you know, that's when a huge kind of chunk of the UK's progress in cutting emissions has happened. You could say that you know, the foundations of that were laid by, you know, by the Climate Change Act and, you know, and the Labour government beforehand and so on. But nevertheless, there has been this great progress, you know, and actually we can kind of lose sight of that to an extent that, you know, that we have had that, you know, that bipartisan progress. But obviously that is, you know, that we're seeing it's to fracture that and the kind of cultural stuff that it's all being caught up in. You know, I don't think there's a kind of a great way out of it, but I guess I kind of come back to that, the thing about the situation we're in now as opposed to 5 years ago, where we actually can appeal to different kind of motives. Like, guys, you want to get out of this, we're in an energy crisis because gas is really expensive. Like, what you want to do in a crisis caused by a commodity being really expensive is do whatever you possibly can to get away from using that thing. And if it so happens that that causes greenhouse gas emissions and getting away from gas is going to be good for climate change, then that's great. But, you know, the fact is, you know, all of those kind of imperatives align. You know, the imperative of energy security, climate change, and cost. You know, the kind of fabled energy trilemma, that actually doesn't exist anymore. You know, that, I mean, that's oversimplifying, obviously, but we're in this, you know, a kind of a blessed situation, if you like, where actually, for selfish kind of reasons, you know, lots of countries are taking huge action on climate change, not because of some altruistic, we want to solve this big environmental problem for the world, but because they fundamentally see it as, you know, in their economic self-interest. And I think, you know, I think that kind of undercuts a lot of this politicising.
Really interesting. Clover, I want to come to you on a point that's kind of cross-cutting a little bit, which is and I'm thinking about this with my CCAG hat, and I go back to the reason we first asked Ade to be our host was because there is always a challenge. We are at CCAG a group of 15 senior scientists. They're great, but translating that level of science into something that's actually digestible is really difficult. And Ade does a brilliant job every month, and it's not easy. But I'm interested in whether you feel like that job is being done well enough for you. Is the latest and best climate science actually being disseminated to young people in the way it should be? And perhaps if not, what do we need to do? How do we do it better?
I think we're all a little narcissistic insofar as if something's interesting to me, I'm naturally going to assume that you're all going to be fascinated by it, right? You see that in the rise of podcasts. You know, everyone thinks they're the next big thing, and I think it's true of climate as well. Like, I think you kind of alluded to it. There's a lot of laziness, and we think, well, because I care about it for this reason, you should care about it for that reason as well. You know, and I personally learned that lesson the hard way when at 11 I declared to my dad that I wanted to become a vegetarian. For context, he is French and a chef. So he was horrified and quite frankly wanted to kick me out of the house. And I tried for years to convince him for the ethical reasons, because that's why I wanted to do it, right? And it wasn't until I armed myself with the science, and in fact, it wasn't until he watched a Netflix documentary on the health benefits of veganism that he called me up 10 years later and said, I think I get this whole plant thing. So we have to, not be lazy. We have to meet people where they are. And I think we have to identify that from a whole multitude of perspectives. For one, again, coming back to the privilege conversation, a lot of people don't have the privilege to think about something as abstract as climate change, as abstract as 1.5 degrees of warming, or polar bears, or even what's happening in Pakistan. From a socioeconomic perspective, a lot of people are just focused on how do I get food on the table? How do I keep the lights on? So there's that dimension. And then there's the other dimension, which is, we work with a lot of business leaders, and for them, they're not motivated by reading the IPCC report or going to COP, but they're motivated because their kids are coming home to them at the end of the day and asking, Mom, Dad, what are you doing about the climate crisis? So we have to meet people where they are. And I think a unifying thing that we can do is, instead of focusing on what separates us, and instead of focusing on these individual narratives, we can focus on the systems that keep us caught in denial, that keep us feeling powerless. It's no accident that denial is as pervasive as it is. We touched on algorithms, but let's talk about the billions of dollars spent over decades by the fossil fuel industry, first denying the science, and now very effectively delaying, because they're saying, oh, well, actually, yeah, you need us in the transition, and you need transition gases, and whatever they can do to make sure that each company is the last company to extract the last barrel of oil. So you have to acknowledge that. You have to acknowledge the Murdoch press. You have to acknowledge, again, the decades of denial from media. BBC was actually referenced in this from the, quote-unquote deniers as being propaganda. I've seen the flip side of that. I've seen a lot of climate denial coming out of the BBC. So, we have to acknowledge what are the systems that keep us stuck, and where can we meet people so that we're not just preaching, but we're actually meeting them based on a values and needs basis.
I smell revolution, Clover. I love it. I love it. It's lovely.
I did tell you. I told you this is what she always brings. One of the things that feels really important and was talked about actually within the report is accountability. The brilliant Aranaba Ghosh, who's one of the members of CCAG, he said something at COP which I just loved. He said, COP is like the film 50 First Dates. Everyone comes every year and it's like the first time they've ever met. And they never look back and say what they talked about last year. They come with nice, shiny new promises. Next year, forget it, same again. And I think what was really interesting is that really played out in the conversations we had, where people are just going, you're going to make some empty promises that don't mean anything. And we talk about it as one of our actions in the report is, I think we all have to be a bit more honest, as whether it's companies or politicians, and say, here's what we've done. Let's talk more about the things we've done and less about the things that we're going to do, or maybe it's a bit of both. And the reason I bring that up, and perhaps this is one for you, Simon, because one of the things you do so brilliantly is you get down in the weeds and you do the accountability piece. I think it's central to everything that you do. So maybe you can perhaps talk a bit to the role of journalism in the accountability piece. And again, how do we drive that? How do we get that message out?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's something that we feel is really important for Carbon Brief, whether it's directly fact-checking, which we only do relatively occasionally, or whether it's, let's say, trying to take a really close look at, like the UK's record, or, how much progress have we actually made? Are we on track? That kind of thing. I mean, I think in terms of the COP situation, people coming back and like the last time it has never happened, I'm not sure that's quite true. And I think one of the other things that I've heard a lot at the COPs that I've been to is this idea that you have these same characters. You talked about ego, and personality and fundamentally people's humanity is so important to all of this. It's not countries, it's like representatives of countries sitting in a room negotiating about stuff. It's politicians personally making pledges and so on. It's people that that really matter, and that's why stories and narratives are so important for this. And things like the personal relationships, you kind of think, well, how committed is Boris Johnson personally to climate action, or has he just looked at the polls that say climate action is, they'd bomb in the polls if they didn't do something about it. Plus his wife is really keen on doing something, right? So of course those things all matter. And with the COP negotiators, they've all been going there and for so many years, and they have their kind of pat answers, I guess. And it's not that so much that they've forgotten what has gone before, but that they can't forget, and that they're kind of stuck in their old ways. I mean, I think accountability is vital, and there's like different kinds of gap between where we're going and where we need to get to, right? And then there's the ambition gap between what people are promised and what they would need to actually deliver to get us to 1.5, for example. But there's also the gap between what's been promised and where we're actually heading, and that's like a big problem for someone like the UK, where we've got these quite ambitious carbon targets, which we're way off track for delivering. And we're going to see a real moment, in a month or so, where the government has to publish a new net zero strategy because of an accountability case brought by a bunch of NGOs at the High Court. And we're quite lucky in the UK that we have that kind of institutional, legislatory kind of backstop where there's legislation that means someone actually can take the government to court and say, you're not actually meeting your commitments, you need to do more. I think that is relatively unusual. I don't think there's so many reports out there, like progress reports, UNEP GAP report, synthesis reports from the UNFCCC. Like, I don't know if more reports is the answer, but addressing those various different gaps is obviously, I don't know. I would end on a positive note though, and just say that I think we shouldn't, amongst all of that soul searching and we're not doing enough-ing, that is obviously important, that we shouldn't lose sight of the progress that has been made, and that speaks to that kind of sense of helplessness. And if we lose sight of how much better off we are now than we were, say, 5 or 10 years ago, then you can easily fall into despondency.
I'm going to come to the room for questions in a moment, so I'm giving you fair warning. Have a think. I'm not sure. Do we have a roaming mic somewhere? I hope we do. I didn't check before, but hopefully someone can find one if not. One of the thoughts, again, that whilst we've been talking, is particularly, Ade, to your point on being relatable or using emotion. Do we need to learn better, dare I say, from the other side, from the Brexiters, from those who do that? It always strikes me that they're so good, and I say one of the things we did within the report and is talked about is we had an activist, we had a scientist, and we had one other. I won't reveal who they all were because you'll know the activist personally, but it was pretty eye-opening. But what I will say is that the media person was Darren Grimes, and boy did he resonate. And he resonated because he talked to them about the things that mattered to them. He did, and it did. So I just wonder, Ade, whether how can we how do we find the things that matter most to particularly these 25% who the stories we're currently telling aren't resonating with?
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. I kind of look at it from my sporting background and working in a team, and I think the way we get the best out of each other is by empowering each other and giving people agency to be able to find ways to express themselves. So it's not a one-way conversation, and giving them tools to be able to find their way out of this. So I think that's really important. I listened to a podcast, now we're talking about podcasts, the other day, and I was listening to a psychologist who was talking about the 12 steps of recovery. And I think what he said is that you will never achieve or recover properly if you don't go through all of those 12 steps. And the final step is for you to go and help someone. And it's for and allow them to help you. So I think we need to have the deniers, the people who are delaying, and I think this report is fantastic actually, because it now gives us an insight into the people that we haven't been able to break through. But we now have to give them an opportunity to converse with us and tell us what they want, what they need, what they're afraid of. You know, it has to be a conversation. That's how we have progressed as a human race. It's never been a one-way thing. When it has been a one-way thing, I mean, that's called empire, and we know how that ends. You know, so we have to find a way where we do this all together.
Yeah, I just want to, I mean, obviously, you know, from a personal level, I completely agree that it's really important to bring people along, and, you know, there's, you know, lots of people out there that, you know, that could be, you know, not persuaded exactly, but I don't know, that aren't, you know, kind of cynical about their opposition. But I also think that it's not, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that actually taking action on climate change, it does have wide majority support in this country, and you know, I don't think it's right to kind of get too sidetracked into worrying about how to communicate with these people.
I get what you mean, because they are a minority, but I think it's an important minority, because they make a lot of noise, and we've got the megaphone of social media, which makes it really difficult to ignore them.
But I think the other thing that I think is that there was a really big push. I'm trying to think when this was, probably about sort of 10 years ago, by a group of prominent climate scientists. I'm thinking of people like Richard Betts, who really made a huge effort to reach out to prominent climate skeptics. You know, there was even like a kind of a sort of infamous dinner where they basically said, let's break bread together, the classic kind of thing. Let's have a chat, and, you know, let's, you know, build bridges, try and find, you know, common ground, all of the things that, you know, kind of talk about. But fundamentally, that group of people were not, you know, they weren't genuine in that engagement. They weren't really interested in, you know, they weren't engaging it in good faith. And I think there's a danger that, you know, some of those people just aren't, and they just, so there's like a hardcore, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I mean, but that's going to happen.
Yeah.
You know, this is going to be hard. Yeah. It's a difficult journey. And just because it's hard doesn't mean we can't continue to have that conversation. We are going to have people who you're just not going to get through to. Yeah. You know, I've seen it. You see it in every walk of life. But I think the more we reach out, just that effort of reaching out, I think will have an impact on other people out there.
I would just add to that. I think what really shone out in the research here was, going back to my three characters, I think you're going to struggle with the conspirators, because frankly, they are exactly the tin pot. If you go and try, they're not doing it in good faith. Mm-hmm. And I think broadly from what we saw, that was a smaller percentage. That was about 5%, but they're very vocal. I think you have a much better chance with the contrarians and the powerless. And I think it goes to Lorraine's point, I think, where it's talking about who are finding the right messengers for them.
Yeah.
And I guess then the challenge is, how do you converse with the right messengers? Because it tends to be people like Darren Grimes. And that's your challenge, isn't it? Is that, Lorraine, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess it depends what you want them to do, because I think, as Simon said, like, if we've got this energy crisis, and then, you know, a lot of people are worried about that and the cost of living crisis and money, you know, to pay your bills, etc., then your messenger doesn't necessarily have to be on board with tackling climate change. They just have to be, let's get everybody to, you know, turn down the thermostat, or whatever behaviour that we're trying to get them to do. So I don't think it's as big a challenge as, you know, I think we have some favourable conditions to get the right messengers to do what we need them to do.
I've heard you many times eloquently talk about win-wins, and this feels like exactly that. We talk within the report about being more targeted with our communications. I think as communications professionals, we say we're targeted, but sometimes I think we get a little bit lazy and we change the headline 3 times and we call it targeted. I think we need to be even more kind of accurate with who we're trying to reach and how. And I think I've heard you use the example, Lorraine, but the wind farm, talking about it about local jobs to one group and talking about it about being clean energy to another, and recognizing those trigger words. If you target them with something that talks about green jobs, don't, because it will immediately trigger something. Could somebody, I can't see much, can someone tell me if there is a roaming mic? Because there is, awesome. Can I get hands up for questions? I think it's that time. And I can't see very well, so I'm going to actually ask the mic. We can go around here first. If you could just share your name and the question, that would be great.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, that's, oh, I hate the echo, it's horrible. Hi, I'm Ant. Hello, everyone. I'm human, but my name's Ant. I guess it's more of an observation. I've actually started working with a consultancy recently, and the reason I joined was because I was interested in this topic in particular, and it's really interesting seeing how what you're saying is aligning with the research that we have. And recently we've been testing, I guess, different audience groups, and it's more, I suppose, a tip to share, but looking at in particular the ones that, for example, who you don't think you could convert, actually by taking a longer term phased approach, knowing that these are scared people who tend to not mix with diverse cultures. They're if you look at kind of the breakdown of diversity in a lot of these areas, especially like the Northwest, for example, that they're very fearful of change. So having a more community-based approach and using actually the people in the community, and I think the NHS kind of clap for carers is a good analogy and a good kind of case study for how you can use communities to drive through more of an organic message. But looking at those three audiences and look to the most converted, how do you bring them on board first, and then how do you then use those people to I guess bring more of a purposeful role to this, to encourage the others to therefore change, and eventually you can, I think, well, I think so anyway, you can end up warming everyone eventually. But that's just what I would share.
Thank you. Can we take a couple more questions and then we'll do them in little batches? I think that might be easier.
Yeah, hi, I'm Emma, and I've got kind of related question, actually, I think. And a couple of the panellists mentioned that, you know, generally the public are supportive of climate action. But there's a huge gap between those that are supportive and those that actually do something. So I think there's something in the work you've done to actually target those people who are ready to go but are confused. They don't know the right information. They don't know what to do, which is the right action to take. And I think one of the, talking about stories to tell or examples to use, Simon, you mentioned, it's a great time at the moment. It's not a great time at the moment. It's a bad time at the moment, but that's a good reason for, looking at energy. But there's some of the stories don't add up. So, at the moment we've got I think it's over half of our energy is renewable, but everyone is caught in this higher energy prices, so people don't see the benefit of renewables. And I just think, why is that story not more prevalent in the media? Why are the media not looking at that issue? Because surely it just doesn't add up, but you don't hear any debate about it.
Thank you. Can we take one more and then we'll have a go?
Is it working? Yeah. Hi.
Sorry, we've got one back there. We'll do this one next. Go ahead at the back, sorry.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to say thanks for running this session. My name's Ajay Lawalia. I'm affiliated to an organisation called Renewable UK, but I'm also here as a member. I wanted to just touch on this point about the messages of hope and showing what good things are being done. Often, if you equate the discussion around Brexit and how it was always the negatives around why it would be bad if we left. Do you think we're doing enough to talk about the positives? We mentioned stories about how we're leading the way when it comes to renewable energy in terms of offshore wind, which I've been working in for over 12 years. There's a lot of positive stories out there. Are we doing enough to share those stories? Thank you.
I think, funnily enough, and probably not surprising, they're all quite connected questions. It's really about, this feels like a critical moment and potential opportunity in a terrible situation. And are we telling enough positive stories? I wonder who would like to have a go at that.
I think people know about wind farms. You're right, there are not connecting to my point about empowering people. We're not.
Ade, is your mic on?
Is that working?
Has it run out?
I think batteries.
Battery's dead.
I talk too much, obviously. I think it's about giving that information out there so people can be empowered and feel empowered, and that's how we get those positive stories out there. But I think people know about some of the basic ones, but there are the natural-based solutions that we don't know enough about. You know, the stuff about rainforests, wetlands, peat bogs. You know, all of these natural-based solutions, which are not hard, and they're there already. And I guess it's our job as people in the media to tell those stories. If the BBC hadn't taken my show off iPlayer, you could have seen all of that stuff. It's on there. But yeah, we do need that positive information to be out there a little bit more. But we have to be careful, because this is a critical situation, and I don't want people to just, because sometimes when you just give people all of this positive information, it can lead to complacency, because we are in a system where people are so distracted and are so filled with so many things that they're forced to do in life just to make ends meet, that they can easily say, well, they're doing it, it's all sorted. We need to be able to get that message across of hope, but still keep the urgency in there, and that's a really difficult balance to strike.
I feel like you've summed up the whole challenge. How do we stay positive in an environment that is so grave is such a challenge. And I wonder if that question kind of plays to something that both Clover and Simon talked about earlier. Clover, your point on lots of private companies want to talk about all the nice, shiny, expensive technologies and less about the perhaps more straightforward, simpler solutions. And how do we redress that balance?
Great question. The first thing I would say, I think to the point that you just made, is that, you know, no matter how loudly we shout the phrase net zero, people aren't going to magically care. And it's so confusing. Like, I've spent over a decade in this space, and I'm still confused by the jargon. Net positive, net zero, carbon offsets, whatever else. And I think there's, again, so much distress because a lot of these definitions are being co-opted and are being taken advantage of. You know,
yeah, I think it's not an accident that it's confusing, right?
Exactly. Like the number of businesses who are like, oh no, don't worry, we've offset our emissions. I can fly around the world every other day because I offset, you know, and
carbon neutral has a lot to answer.
Yeah, exactly, right? So, but there's a really interesting study they did in the States where they asked people about climate, and it became very polarized very quickly, politically. However, if they talk to people about the solutions, the grassroots solutions that underpin climate policy and climate education, you know, access to education being one, regenerative agriculture, you know, community-led decentralized farming over 5 corporations owning all of the world's food, you know, nature-based solutions. When you talk about this stuff, people across the board are absolutely pro, you know, and can absolutely get behind it. So we need to talk about solutions on that very grassroots level. And again, when it comes to kind of agency and empowerment, you know, how often do we actually hear the stories of not just the individuals, because we love to hero worship, but the collectives of people who are leading solutions on the ground, who might not care, frankly, about the climate crisis, but do care about the fact that their community has reliable energy that is affordable and clean, who do care about the fact that they have access to good food.
Do you know what? Part of that I also think is, in a way, a little bit of an arrogance of us in the West in thinking that we do things the best. You know, when you travel to I travel a lot as part of my job, going to countries around the continent of Africa and Asia, and you see the natural-based solutions that they use and the way that they're more connected with the planet. We need to open our eyes and start learning from some of these indigenous communities who are looking after the planet far better than we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to that point as well, it's so easy to feel overwhelmed, right? Like if you go on social media, it takes 3 scrolls to read about what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening with monoculture cropping, what's happening with coral bleaching in Australia, what's happening in Pakistan. And you know, we've never had such an access to an abundance of information, and an information that is very kind of dystopian and despairing. If there's one thing I've learned about how to mobilize people, it's that impact comes from focus. If you look at anyone in the world who has made a difference, who has made an impact in their community, they haven't tried to do all of the things. They haven't spread themselves thin across the issues. They've said, this is the issue that ignites a fire in my belly. And these are the skills and the talents that I have to show up and solve that problem. So we need to help people understand what that trigger and catalyst is for them. And then we need to empower and nurture people to feel confident in taking that action. Like, frankly, screw the politicians. We have to take power back upon ourselves.
I mean, I can't honestly disagree with any of that. But I also.
But you will.
It's a tangent in a way. But there's a big movement in journalism towards this kind of solutions journalism as a thing, like basically trying to tap into this. Like, people are energized by these kinds of positive stories, and you're finding those grassroots people and movements and so on. And that's all great. But I'm very nervous about the idea of putting things back on individuals. And obviously, yay for people power and all that, and that's great. But fundamentally, climate change is such a big systemic problem that we can't solve it unless, governments, policies, systems, corporations, the whole thing has to change.
So I agree with you, but I sometimes think it needs us to kick off before the government does anything. Because at the moment, if we sit around waiting for governments, I mean, governments can do so much, but there's so many mechanisms that they have to maneuver through that it often takes them too long. The mechanism that they have is probably too slow for the problem that we have.
I think yay for people power should be the new slogan, actually.
Yeah.
But I think to that point, that's part of the fossil fuel industry's agenda, to focus on individual action in terms of like tick boxing solutions, like just buy a reusable coffee cup, just turn off the lights when you leave a room. That's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking individual action. Like, institutions, as overwhelming as they are made up of organizations which are made up of collectives of individuals.
Yeah.
And actually, we need to throw out the individual narrative and say our power lies in coming together. Like, you look at Extinction Rebellion in 2019, the UK was the first country to declare a climate emergency as a result of XR shutting down London. And then the UK government promptly introduced the policing bill to stop our democratic right to protest, right? But we need to focus on the fact that we're all interconnected. We depend on one another. Liberation isn't one person becoming free from the oppressor. It's all of us. And that's why we need to focus on intersectionality. We can't talk about the environment without talking about racial justice. We have to talk about economic privilege. We have to talk about dismantling systems of power.
Lorraine?
How do I talk that? No, I was just going to kind of say something similar, which is like we have multiple roles, right? So yes, we can directly reduce our carbon footprint in various ways, like e.g. as consumers, but we're citizens, we're professionals, we're members of communities. These are things, and particularly the professionals' role that many of us have, there are decisions that we can make in the workplace, and we can influence our colleagues and managers to take actions like within those organizations that will have much wider effects and start to change structures that currently inhibit individual change. So I think it is about thinking about the role of the multiple roles that we have that we can kind of exert influence.
And we should stop talking about government as in them and us, because they are us and we are them.
The one comeback on that is that just purely from a journalistic point of view, I see all too often that question about what can people do does turn back onto the individual action, which is kind of rubbish, right? And so I'm very much in favour of like what are those narratives and the stories and about solutions, but in a way that addresses systems and not just individuals, because it's easy to get public transport if that system exists, right? I wanted to come back on that question about why aren't we getting cheap electricity, because lots of it's renewable. This is fundamentally, it's just really boring. It's about how markets operate. It's marginal pricing. Gas is the marginal fuel. That means it sets the price. The government's looking at reforming the way the electricity market operates. But when I talk to my colleagues about it, their eyes glaze over, and frankly mine glaze over slightly. The trade press, specialist journalists are kind of talking about this, but it's really hard to find a way in, and it's quite hard to explain.
You've got to find a better line than marginal pricing.
That's what it's called.
I just wanted to make two quick points. points before I go to more questions. One thing that really struck me at COP 27 in Sharm was I was at a dinner with some fairly political heavyweights, and the conversation was mostly around neoliberalism and how much it has to answer for. And I thought that was quite interesting, because these were essentially the bastions of neoliberalism talking about it. And that in itself, I think, is progress, actually. I do think that there's a lot of reflection that the system is not exactly working and delivering for this. The second point I would just make, and it's what I've referred to a lot in this country, is the Marcus Rashford politics effect. Like, people can make real bloody differences because politicians they are us, as you said, Ade. They need our votes. And when they see the popular mark move, things happen. And that's why I think, people like you, Clover, and the young, not just the young XR, all these groups who really do mobilise are so important.
I don't think the net zero legislation would have happened when it, at the time that it did, without XR and without that Attenborough moment, all of those things coming together.
Any more questions? I saw quite a few hands up.
I've got one. What do I do? This. Hello, I'm Juliet Kinsman. I'm a sustainability. I'm a member of the media. We get really hard half the time. I'm a member of the media, can you tell? It's not working. So I just wanted to say it's really hard to often hear, thank you so much, wow, lots of them, to hear the media, we all talk about them and us, and you're generalising and you say the media. We all do it, we're all guilty of it, Prince Harry sure does it. But please, honestly, I work so hard, whether you want to label it solutions journalist, to try and share fact-checked, accurate information so people can make better informed choices and decisions that help the climate. But please, the media is dying. Only 2% of what's consumed is that behind a paywall. That is, obviously it's hard to survive. We want to be telling, not selling, but we need to finance it. Think about how we all consume things. So Clover, I would also ask, we mentioned the BBC. I've worked for all of the big publishers, and probably in the last year. There are a lot of good guys there working very, very hard, and we know that. But how do we amplify our messages in an effective way to inspire behavioural change? I mean, I might have a small Instagram following, but it's certainly dying. And I know a lot of what we're all talking about. How do we really influence people and share information effectively?
Great question.
It's so long, sorry.
It's a great question. Before you come in, can we'll do what we did last time and take a couple at a time, if that's okay. There's some everywhere.
Thank you. I'm Rose, and Rose Gator, and I'm a comms and engagement professional. And I was just thinking about how with any project that actually succeeds, you need to have a vision of what success looks like. And what I think with this particular issue is that success to all of us means we stay under 1.5. And that basically translates as it's slightly less of a catastrophe than the other catastrophe. And that seems like quite a hard sell when we need to make such huge changes. There's going to be a catastrophe, guys, whether you like it or not. It's just that this is going to be slightly less of one. How do you feel, how can we show what success looks like in a way that is both, realistic's probably the wrong word, but that we show what we can achieve together, and we need that to motivate people. I'm just not sure that that's quite there. I feel like for any successful project, and this is kind of a project in a way, that we need to show what that looks like.
Cool, these are easy, light questions, aren't they? Can we take one more? I think...
I have the mic, so I'm going to jump in.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm Allie. I'm with the University of Chicago School of Business. Actually, kind of to tack on to what I think Rose just asked, Chicago is a city with a sort of long, much publicized gun violence struggle. And I just wonder if there are things that we could learn from organizations that are dealing with other big, scary problems, like gun violence in the US. Like, are there, like, perhaps organizations that have made gains? Are there things that we could learn in the climate communications circles?
I like that question. Can we take one more? I think we can deal with one more. I've got them.
Thank you. There seems to be a lot of competition for the mic, so I feel privileged. I just want to pick up a little point about this issue about trusted messages and misinformation. And I think there's probably a lot of sort of corporate PR people in the room today, and I do think, to a certain extent, sort of the public relations industry and the investor relations industry is part of the problem at the moment. That I counted the other day, there are six different flavours of greenwashing. There is, wait for it, green hushing, green crowding, green lighting, green shifting, green labelling, and green rinsing. And this is a product of the fact that companies have been disingenuous about their sort of climate credentials. And I would say that one of the big problems at the moment is this sort of framework that we've created, which is called ESG, so environmental, social, and governance. Oh, sorry, dropped my glass. And it was sort of created with good intentions. It was created to encourage companies to think very carefully about these three factors. But on the, sort of my train journey in this morning, I did a quick Google of Rio Tinto, and there's lots of rating agencies there that rate companies' ESG credentials. And Rio Tinto, you know, a company which lost a radioactive pellet in Western Australia, a company that, hope there's no one here from Rio Tinto, by the way, a company that's had a report and put its hand up about systemic sexual harassment at its sites. It's a company that destroyed Aboriginal sites. It had a rating of 81 out of 100, which ranks it excellent when it comes to ESG ratings. So I think there's something wrong here. And you know, the PR industry and the IR industry have got very, very clever at gaming the system and presenting fairly, you know, disingenuous information about climate and also about society.
Thanks, Clayton. What a challenging set of questions they are. I'm going to start with the media, them and us, and actually particularly the question about how can we amplify the right messages better is essentially what that question was. Clover, you were going to come in on that, so you can come in on it now.
Okay. Big question, but a great question. I think the first thing is, when it comes to kind of legacy media, as I refer to it, and like incumbents, there is a tendency to kind of dig your heels in and not want to move with the times. And I've definitely witnessed that, you know, having conversations with people in high up places in media. And I think we have to acknowledge that times have changed and times have moved on, and the way that people access information is radically different now than it was 10 years ago, and it's going to continue evolving. And so there's a responsibility within the media to think about, well, how do we actually keep pace and how do we stay above the curve rather than kind of catching up with the people from the quote-unquote other side, the very nefarious side, who are peddling, you know, climate misinformation. And I think a huge part of that is around engaging young people, right? Engaging influencers, engaging activists. You know, there's a huge trend that's been blowing up on Instagram and TikTok the past couple of weeks on de-influencing. And it started off as, you know, here are the products not to buy, and it quickly turned into basically an anti-consumerist campaign that's global and decentralized. So, you know, there are these opportunities to really galvanize and tap in. I have a friend, Alex House, who's a big influencer on TikTok. Everything he does is around galvanizing young people on the platform to go vote, to get engaged in their communities. He's managed to galvanize hundreds of thousands of voters through his, you know, quick, snippy messages and campaigns. He's not putting out long-form content, but he's found a really effective way of spreading awareness and actually activating people to take action. So there needs to be much more of a dialogue. On a very, you know, personal front, my sister is a climate change conspiracy theorist. The gasps. You know, and so I struggle with that day in, day out. But what's really interesting, and again, this comes back to a point that I think we've reiterated throughout the night, she might believe that climate change is a conspiracy theory orchestrated by Al Gore, but she loves gardening. And I, remarked on the fact that she liked growing her own food. And again, this comes from another conspiracy that she doesn't believe in, mass agriculture. But actually, I said, well, regenerative agriculture, growing food in your own backyard is a really important solution. And from that place, we were able to have a super open dialogue. So again, I think storytelling comes down to meeting people on a very personal level, approaching without judgment, approaching without bias, having that humility. And that means platforming more diverse spaces, more diverse voices in these spaces as well.
I think that backs up my theory that biodiversity is the gateway drug for climate deniers. Lorraine, did you look like you might want to come in?
You read my mind. So I was only just going to say that, of course, the media also have a huge role to play, not only in terms of news coverage of climate change and ways in which to shift from problem framing to solution framing there, but also in all of its content in terms of like creative coverage of all sorts of content. So, from soap operas and dramas and other things, it's about normalizing low carbon choices, for example, and just kind of getting things in there and just kind of challenging the assumption that having a huge house and jetting off on holidays is a great thing and normal. So because we know that actually, things like domestic abuse lines in the Archers led to a huge increase in people phoning up domestic abuse helplines and things, and there have been other storylines that have led to huge amounts of change. So, so just to sort of flag that it's not just the news. Oh, great.
I was just going to add to the specific point about amplifying. Ask. One of the things I mentioned earlier is we're really bad with our egos because we've got jobs and they might be doing PR or being the media or doing these things, and we go, well, we know how to do it best. Ask. Ask young people how they do it, where they do it, and you'll do it, engage. I can't say that enough. I try with all of this CCAG content we create, and I haven't cracked it yet, but it's every time we do it, I ask, how can we do this better? How can we work this to work on the contents that you use? We have a couple more questions to rattle through that I've written down. The vision of 1.5, I think, is really interesting. And in my mind, this sort of links to Clayton's point on ESG as well. The point on 1.5 was how do we galvanize, or it's kind of become a target, is what I heard. It's like 1.5 is like, we're going that much disaster's okay. That's the narrative we've allowed to be drawn because, and I just wonder if it's because once you put something out there as a acceptable thing, it becomes a de facto target. And I wonder if there's a communications challenge there. So let's start with that one, thinking about is that fair? How should we approach the 1.5? Do we talk about it in the right way? Do we need to talk about it differently? Clover? Just no.
I'm going to insert a quote from Johan Rockström from the World Economic Forum a few days ago, or last week. He said it so eloquently. He said, 1.5 degrees is not a political target. It's a scientific tipping point.
Yeah.
So we just need to remember that when we're talking about 1.5. It's very convenient to treat it as a goal and then say, oh, well, then it's not such a big deal if we go to 1.6 or 1.8 or 2 degrees. It's a climate environmental tipping point.
Yeah. The fact is, once we go beyond 1.5, we no longer can predict the weather, and that is huge, absolutely huge for people in Africa, in Asia, all over the world. At the moment, look how bad it is, and we're not even at 1.5. Just imagine what it's going to be like.
I was just going to say, that is, there's a scientist who's just left this room who I know if he was still here would tell you 1.5 is too much.
Yeah.
And if anything that climate scientists have shown us over the last 20 years is that we're not at the top of the guesses. The range doesn't tend to look so pretty going backwards. Simon, I'm sure you have thoughts on 1.5.
Yeah, There's a few different angles. So in terms of like 1.5 as a limit or a target, I mean, I'm always very conscious when in our own journalism at Carbon Brief of avoiding framing it as a target, because it isn't. It's a limit. But I'm also equally conscious of people talking about what did you say, ecophobia? You said, and that sense of despair that a lot of people feel that humanity's doomed. I don't. My own understanding is that there isn't like a tipping point beyond which we go from safe to not safe. It doesn't really work like that. We go from like disastrous to even more disastrous to it's probably even worse and we're not sure in which ways. And it isn't like a discrete moment, like there isn't a tipping point in that sense, like where we fail if we suddenly go to 1.6 and if, it's a great success if it's 1.5. It doesn't really work like that. But in terms of like how to sell success, I think that's like a different thing. And I think there is a shift in the way that people talk about climate action away from this idea that it's a big sacrifice, that we have to do it because it's otherwise terrible consequences, which ultimately is quite a hard sell. Like we're going to have to do a load of expensive, difficult stuff because otherwise bad things might happen in 50 years. Like that's not really a vote winner. But you see with things like the framing, in Joe Biden's Inflation Recovery Act, this narrative about a green transition and jobs of the future, a green industrial revolution. Now a lot of that it can be questionable and ESG and blah blah blah, but fundamentally selling the positives. What does success look like? It means walking down the street and not having to breathe petrol fumes. It means grannies not freezing to death in winter because they have a properly insulated house that they can afford to keep warm. It means, people across sub-Saharan Africa having access to cheap renewable energy. So I think, that narrative shift towards the positive framing about, and by the way, we might solve climate change, I think that's a positive, and I think that's much more likely to be successful. I just wanted to comment very briefly on this information thing, and this kind of overwhelming deluge of information that we're faced with now. I kind of often remember what was a kind of a pivotal moment for me as a child in school, where a teacher brought in like 5 different newspapers and got us to read the same story in each of them, and it was a kind of eye-opening experience about information, how it's presented, how different narratives are formed. And I think, it's really important, I don't know what the solution to this is, but it's really important for the public to be intelligent consumers of information, but without kind of tipping over into that kind of conspiracy theory, kind of do your own research kind of thing, like don't believe anything. Obviously, we have to trust in experts, but we also have to intelligently consume, the sort of multitude of information we're faced with.
Don't you think that would come from school age, though? I think sometimes by the time it gets to our age, it's too late. Some people are so entrenched in understanding how to disseminate what's right and what's wrong in information. So I think we need to start earlier. We're now in a world which is overloaded with information. It's way different than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And we're not arming the next generation with the tools in how to understand that and how to navigate that world.
I'm getting hands to wrap up, I'm afraid. I just want to make, and we've got a question, one more, and before we talk about the gun violence, because I think that's particularly interesting, thinking about lessons from other social causes, I'm going to answer briefly the point on the PR industry and the IR industry. I couldn't agree more. I think that we've talked about this internally around what's our role? We're storytellers. I think we have a real role in accountability and saying to people, it goes back to the point about people always want to putting out the new announcement, the new thing, and actually just sense checking, even if it's just at a very basic level, and saying, is this additive? Is this honest? Or are we actually becoming part of the problem? I think it's a real important role that we as communications professionals have to play. I'm going to finish on the question around social justice and other lessons, because I think it's a really good one. What can we learn from other social causes that we've seen be successful? I think, Clovey, you referred to some earlier, so perhaps I'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I will say, which I think is interesting in light of the kind of Just Stop Oil protests and a lot of the rhetoric around activists in that context, the first thing that the media did, at least from what I saw and heard, was dehumanize. Do everything they could to vilify and dehumanize the people who were legitimately putting their bodies on the line to protest. And that's true of environmental land defenders around the world, many of whom lose their lives every year doing this work. And they did the same thing with the suffragettes, back in the day. And in fact, the suffragettes, I would argue, were a lot more extreme than, Just Stop Oil and XR protesters. They were planting bombs. There were plans to put bombs in St. Paul's Cathedral. And at the time, it was seen as terrorism, and it was seen as incredibly disruptive and destructive. And, I see that in many ways playing out now again. I think we saw that with Black Lives Matter as well. Anything to kind of discredit, make out that people who are, effectively fighting for their lives are, somehow asking too much and are, crazy and whatever else. So I think we have to be very conscious about the kind of like co-opted branding when it comes to activism. For me, an activist is simply someone who cares. I had someone working in the mining industry trying to change things from the inside out approach me recently and ask, I really care and I'm trying to change. Can I call myself an activist? And I was like, I don't care. You're the judge of that, So I think, looking back to previous movements, there's lots we can learn. But in essence, we need to make sure they're accessible. We need to make sure they're inclusive. And we need to call out the kind of vilification that happens through the media, because the moment we can dehumanize a group, the moment we can discredit it, the moment government can come in with policies that actually prevent us from protesting and taking to the streets.
Ade, you look like you might have some
No,
thoughts.
I totally agree with Clover. I think it's, I always come from the perspective of just trying to understand where people are coming from. I guess that's what my job is, to understand why people are making their argument, and too often we don't do that, and I guess it feels like there are forces that are trying to turn us against each other, which is it's so frustrating and so annoying that we have that. But I guess it's about listening. It's about listening, and it's not about listening to talk or listening to have an answer. Is about listening to hear, to hear what people say, allow people to be heard, and we're not getting that enough.
Brilliant. What an awesome conversation. I'm seeing lots of disappointed faces from people who haven't managed to ask a question, and I'm sorry. We have access to this room for a few minutes, I hope, so please have a mingle, have a chat. The bar is open upstairs. You're all encouraged to go and use it long into the night. I should also add the reports that we've been referring to. There's some copies at the back. There's also some business cards with a QR code that you can scan to access the report. Finally, let me say thank you to these amazing panelists. What an easy job this is when you have these guys.